This has been a journey that I've been on for the last 2 years. And basically my background is in neuroscience. I did a PhD that finished 2 years ago, and I was developing a model that I thought could be useful in academia to disrupt the journal system. But I was reaching the conclusion that I don't think academia is a safe space to prototype the type of radically transparent models that I'm interested in. And so I decided to leave academia. I've been funding myself for the last couple of years and using a very different space to prototype this same model. And that's what I'll be sharing today. So Open Heart and Mind is basically, this is the overview. So there's kind of 3 sections. So I'll give you an introduction to what we're doing at Open Heart and Mind, the model that I've been developing, and then the second section, I'll take you through some pilot data that is a proof of concept of the model. And then in the third part will be a sort of more open discussion, and that's where I'm really interested in hearing from all of you about ways that this might be useful in academia, and then potentially getting started on designing an application for AIMOS itself. So OM and the wisdom model. So what is OM? OM is, I think of it like an intersection of open science and gift-based gatherings. So if you've ever heard of Burning Man, you'll know what I mean. But these are basically contribution-based festivals, similar to the way that we contribute in academia. And on a sort of technical front, we are a community and a citizen science project that has 300 or more members who have applied to join at our festivals over the last couple of years. We're also a DGR registered charity, thanks to the work of Kaylee here, who's been shepherding a charity that we've merged with as of June last year. I think of it as building a new game from the ground up. Has anyone ever played Monopoly? Show of hands, Monopoly. Yeah, so Monopoly scarred me as a child because I had two older brothers, and we would love playing games, but they were always smarter and better than me at these games. And that was fine normally because the game would end, but Monopoly is that game that just keeps on going after you know you've already lost. And you have to keep hopping around the board, desperately trying to survive when everybody else has all of the resources and ability to squash you like an ant. Yeah, so that's where I was going with it. So back then I didn't know how to gracefully resign. And so I would get angry and I'd tip the board and I'd have a huff, and then I'd get in trouble for fighting with my brothers. But when I finished my PhD, I decided that I would instead gracefully resign from the game of academia because it had already given me a mental breakdown, and I felt if I continued in this, I was going to continue suffering, and I didn't want to keep playing this game because at the end of the day, there are rules that we ascribe to, and as we continue to play these rules, we reinforce the game that we're playing. And so what I've been working on instead is designing a new game from the ground up. And I've been motivated by the key problems that we have in academia, which primarily is incentivizing good behaviors. How do we align what we know are good for our community, like transparency, reliability, access, inclusivity, diversity, with the system mechanics itself? And like I said, these are some pretty radical ideas that I didn't feel were very safe to prototype in academia. So I've been moving into the festival space and using festivals over the series of the last 2 years to explore this type of community organization model in a real setting. And the reason for that is that we have the same basic parameters. So we have people, contributors who do stuff, contributions, that is of more or less value to the community on some number of dimensions of interest. And so in the festival scene, this might be creativity or necessity. In academia, it could be impact, reliability, basically parameters that are up to the community's choosing. And yeah, like I said, there's fewer risks and constraints in academia. It's also a really diverse space. So festivals bring together a really diverse community, and they, depending what you put on at the festival, can entice a really diverse section of the community. But also on a more personal front, they're kind of good for you because you get to learn about stuff that I didn't know about in my academic career, like well-being and taking care of myself. And also they're kind of fun. So it's been a really enjoyable way to explore these ideas in a much more safer context. And so this has been our journey since November of 2021, which was just as we were re-emerging out of COVID here in Brisbane. That was when we had our first pilot festival that was 120 people or so. And yeah, actually, I should say along the top of this journey, what you'll see is the sort of real life activities that we've hosted over the last couple of years. And then on the bottom side is the technology that we've been iterating on over the past 2 years to explore this model. And so before and after each of the gatherings, we have an opportunity to do some kind of like a pre-review of what's been offered to the festival, as well as a post-review, as in opportunity for the community to say what they liked and didn't like about the festival. So yeah, we've hosted a number of gatherings, all of which are between 100 and 150 people. And we've moved iteratively through a number of different versions of this system that we're developing. And it brings us to where we're at today. And there was a lot in there, and it's been a huge journey for the last 2 years. And this is by no means everybody who's been involved. But these are the key players and people who have contributed, particularly in 2022, our first year. And I haven't had a chance to update this slide for 2023, but I also don't have the data on that yet. So yeah, like I want to highlight Kaylee, like I said, who shepherded this charity into our hands. Ben has been developing our app, which I was hoping would be ready for release for this conference, but as app development goes, it can take a bit longer than expected. Jilly was behind the scenes doing lots of finance and admin and managing the roadmap development. Riley was also on the board of our charity. Troy is hands-on with the web development, operations. Lauren was doing a lot of photography for our earlier events. Angie is our lead artist who's been developing open and replicable art that people can recreate at their festivals. And then, yeah, I also want to acknowledge our anonymous funder who has been funding this work through their very generous donation. So that brings me to the system, which is probably what you all are interested in, more so than festivals. And the way I think of this is an autonomous system to track, evaluate, and reward any contribution to a community while also incentivizing engagement. So the basic idea is that if you take the entire set of contributions that might make up a community, and let's say AIMOS, and you look at all of those diverse community contributions, which could be, you know, the talks and the workshops that we see here, but it's also the emails behind the scenes. It's the organizing flights for keynotes. It's paying money. It's the $80 that we all paid to register for this conference. Think of all of those as energetic inputs to a project. And the goal of our system is to basically figure out a rank order for all of those diverse contributions, because if we can do that, then we can give each of them a token value that represents the relative value to our community, that can then be a representation of, or the value they've added to the community, but also a token that they can then pay forward and use within the community as a kind of currency. And so in doing so, obviously that's a ridiculously big vision and it's impossible to do correctly, but we can just accept from the outset, we're never going to do that perfectly. Like, how can we ever do that perfectly? But we can take iterative steps towards doing that better from where we're at now, which is 0. And we can progressively over time, as we collect data and understand how this system needs to work, we can get closer to that outcome of interest. So yeah, I think I said that it can handle, well, the idea is to handle diverse contributions. I guess one thing I want to highlight there is that reviews themselves are a valuable contribution, and so should also be included in that contribution set. And that's kind of the key feature of what we're doing, but I'll come back to that in a minute. And yeah, my interest here is disruption, to be honest. Like, I'm interested in disrupting academia and creating a new system where we're in charge and in control and getting fairly recognized for the valuable work that we do. And so for it to disrupt, I think it's got to have a number of characteristics. Obviously, we're interested in things being transparent, replicable, reliable. I think it also needs to be inclusive and accessible. And that means that the system that we're developing needs to be user-friendly so that people that aren't very tech-friendly can also get involved and, you know, play their part in the citizen science world. And also, yeah, I think it needs to incentivize engagement directly. So especially honest reviews, they need to be rewarded within the system that we develop. And for it to scale and disrupt, then it would also need to be flexible. It would need to be dynamic. and scalable and also decentralized. So this is the development that we've been doing. So yeah, like I said, each festival we've sort of explored a new model and learned from that, and then iterated and developed the next version. So our first version was pretty basic. We gave people a bunch of tokens and we gave them a list of contributions and said, just hand out those tokens in whatever way you think makes sense. We also ran a second survey that was intending to explore the idea of pre-filling that list of contributions, but I won't go into that. But basically, yeah, the outcome was that as expected, it was an incredibly biased response. Some people, one person in particular gave me all of their tokens, which literally can't be, like, I literally cannot have provided all of the value. But yeah, there was generally a kind of biased response in that it wasn't necessarily a fair distribution of tokens. It also was relatively non-inclusive because it took quite a while for people to do this sort of process. And you also had to have a kind of understanding of the entire set of contributions to do that task fairly, because how else do you individually allocate tokens? So both of those were obstacles. And also people felt a bit uncomfortable with the idea of handing out tokens, like sort of scoring things. That was like a discomfort factor. So the second version that we moved on to was basically multi-dimensional ratings using rubrics, or at least that was the intention. We started prototyping that for a gathering that didn't actually happen in 2022 because of some floods and some other issues that happened. But we already learned from that process of starting the review process that actually that wasn't going to work, because if you want to have, like, that's a really great model, but it only works so well when you've got relatively heterogeneous, like similar contributions, because then you can write a rubric that describes what's the score 1, what's the score 2, what's the score 3. But if you now add in financial contributions and you add in like talks and workshops and volunteer services and DJ acts, you now need a new rubric for every single type of contribution. And so very quickly that blows out of manageability, and it's not a scalable solution for at least the problem that I'm interested in trying to solve. And so then that led to the what I think is a key idea, and it's nothing new. Many of us have probably used these types of analyses, or at least been involved with experiments that have, and that's basically pairwise comparisons. So two alternative forced choice. And the basic idea is if you take that set of contributions and you pull out any 2 contributions, then you can ask this person a really simple question, which is which of these 2 comparisons is more X. So that can be whatever dimension you're interested in asking. But when you then do that lots and lots of times over a really diverse community, then you get a really rich data set that can result in that rank ordering that we're interested in, then captures what the crowd thinks, not any one reviewer like we sort of see in academia. And so, yeah, we prototyped this for a festival called TinyOn, which is the data that I'll be showing you later. And one of the learnings was that people found this pretty quick and easy. Like it took on average less than 1 minute to do one of these comparisons across 4 dimensions that we asked people about. And yeah, that was kind of motivation to continue developing this. And so now we're developing an app that's based on this and will be released at some point. And yeah, I just want to highlight that. Yeah, so I think one innovation was the idea to use pairwise comparisons at the crowd level. But the really unique thing that we're doing here is, I think of it as self-referential pairwise comparisons. And another way to think of it is meta review. So in kind of traditional academia, you might have someone that does a review on a paper, but then those reviews can be of variable quality. So then some proposals out there in the literature and some models propose meta review. So you could have people that review the reviews, but then who's reviewing the meta reviews, right? So you end up with this like chain of like, you can't close that loop if you don't have some way to, for that mechanism to be self-referential. And so what we're doing here is actually including reviews in the contribution set. So what that looks like in practice is that if you're doing in our app and you're given 2 contributions to review and compare, then one of those contributions might be a DJ act, and another contribution might be 100 pairwise comparisons. And so now you're being asked to imagine, okay, I'm sitting here, I'm doing 100 of these comparisons. That takes me like maybe an hour or something of my time. Is that more or less valuable to the community, or whatever dimension we ask about, than 100 pairwise comparisons, or 10, or whatever factor we want to put in there? And by doing so, we can then give pairwise comparisons a fixed number, because they're relatively standard, right? Like people tend to go through the same process, and you're basically participating in a pretty standard review protocol that we can give 1 token of value to. So we call ours in our system omnoms, like delicious little treats that you appreciate, or it could also stand for nominations because we're nominating things that we appreciate. But yeah, the idea is that we then give these pairwise comparisons 1 omnom each, and that then gives us a mechanism to scale the entire system. So every other contribution can now be scaled relative to the pairwise comparisons themselves as like a fundamental unit of value. And what's cool about that is that different communities could adopt the same platform. So we at AIMOS are doing it, and we're reviewing DJ sets and cleaning the toilets or whatever it might be. But AIMOS could also potentially adopt the same protocol, the same concept, and they could be reviewing totally different things, so talks and the catering and whatever it might be. But because everything's scaled around a kind of meta concept, which is this review of contributions, they become relatively comparable. So now we've got 2 different communities that are talking about value within their own community, but can communicate that value across the communities. And if you've got then communities that are pretty aligned, like I would suggest AIMOS and AIMOS are, then you've now got a mechanism for those communities to communicate and also share resources, ideas, and exchange value in a relatively seamless and evidence-based way. So I want to probably come back to that in the very end, because I'm going to pitch that we can do this at AIMOS, and I would love to do this with anyone that wants to do this. But the next slide is the model. So yeah, I think of this as closing the value loop. So it's kind of like a circular process that continues to iterate, and over time we just keep evolving and improving this until it gets closer to our ideal. And the first step is creating. So in our community, it's co-creating these festivals. In academia, it's basically any contribution to the commons. So you write a paper, you submit some code. This is the creation phase. The second thing that we do, and I was interested in Carl's talk today because he talked about how we don't track behavior, and I think we should, because we should be rewarding good work whether or not there's good outcomes at the end of it. And so what we aim to do, again recognizing that we're imperfect, is to record every single contribution. And we can, as a community, decide what scope and degree, do we want to record every single minute task? That's probably not reasonable. And we can chunk things in different ways. But the goal is to basically record as much as we possibly can so that we can then put it into our rating engine. And so what we're doing, I'll tell you about what we're doing at AIMOS in the next slides. So yeah, once it's been recorded, then we import it into this app that we're developing for the review. The third phase is to appreciate. So this is where people do their pairwise comparisons, and they're appreciating the contributions on different dimensions of interest. The fourth phase is using algorithms. So this is where we take those votes, and according to whatever algorithm version we're up to, we create the rank outcome that gives a score to each of those contributions. There's another factor here that's not necessary for the model, but there's an idea that we could have meta reviewers that are also ranking the quality of those dimensions themselves. So I'll show you some data where I at least think some of the dimensions we captured aren't really doing a very good job. And then, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Okay, yeah. So 4B is reward. So this is where we actually give people the omnoms that represent the value that they brought to the community. And in the data, I'll also show you some concepts or some ideas about how those tokens might then be paid forward within the community and become a kind of value exchange system. And then fifth all of our data is transparent and open and available. So what's cool then is that we can start interrogating it to find out who are the experts in our community. Because if we're tracking value over time and we have, say, some tags associated to each of those contributions, then we will know who's producing value to the community over time, and we can start to generate a really rich profile about someone's expertise and give them reputation scores that reflect that. And also, yeah, another thing that we can do is we can look at the reviewers themselves. So are they actually reviewing reliably? So when we do test retest, are they actually like a high quality reviewer that's sitting there and thinking about what they value, or are they just clicking buttons to try and earn their own ones? And then finally, or kind of first, there's also the idea, I personally believe in a universal basic income. I think we should all have all of our basic needs met. And so we're exploring models for this at OM, but the basic premise is that if you have an excess of OMNOMs that show that you've contributed value to your community, you can then trade them in to have your basic needs met. So you could trade them in to pay your rent or get some food or whatever it might be. Or we could also have a pathway for people to apply. So disadvantaged minorities that don't even have access to get in and start creating from the outset, we could potentially support people to become part of the community and get involved in this pinwheel cycle. So that's part one. I'm not sure if I should take questions now or just launch into the data. What would people like? Who's hands up for questions? Hands up for data.
Maybe some of the questions will be answered by the data.
Yeah, okay, cool. Thank you. All right, so yeah, to rewind, this is data from TinyOM, which we held last June in Brisbane. And what I'm going to be showing you, or what we did was we had a pre-event review where basically the crowd got to select the headline acts. But what I'm going to focus on is the post-event review, because that's much more interesting data. And so, yeah, I'm going to take you through each of those stages of our model and just show you what we did and show you what data is available. So in the creation, we gathered and we co-created. It was an all-day gathering that went from 10 a.m. to 10 p.m. We didn't actually count how many people because it was an open event to the public, but we estimate over 100 people came along and were involved. We had a number of performers, presenters, organizers, kind of core crew. And then, like I said, we had these pre-event reviewers who were doing reviews as well. And it was two stages. One was primarily like workshops and talks. We had some science talks and some hooping workshops and like an art workshop as well. And then the other stage was primarily music, where we had DJs and musicians playing awesome music throughout the day. And we also had a collective food circle. So we all came together for one meal at lunch and shared a meal. Oh yeah, I also should say, if someone wants to log on, you can see the results using that link that'll be on all these slides. So yeah, next stage is record. We recorded all of our contributions in our transparent workspace. We are using this app that is a third-party app called ClickUp. It's not open source. I would love if it was. But the reason I chose to move forward with that is it's, I think, a really cool piece of technology that's very similar to Notion, but also builds in task tracking. So I think of it as kind of like a task tracker merged with Google Docs, where you've got collaborative writing. And to me, that was a really powerful space where we could capture all of the contributions to a community. And so, yeah, basically we recorded as many contributions as we possibly could, and then selected some of those to be imported into our Wisdom prototype for evaluation. So we selected 27 contributions to the actual event. So these were talks, music, donations. You can see all those over here. And then we also created 3 review contributions. So these were representing someone who had done 1, 4, or 16 surveys. And in each of these surveys, there's 25 pairwise comparisons. So there's a lot of choices you're being made, but it's a relatively easy task. And so, yeah, it's kind of like a breakdown there of what contributions were contributed. So then next phase is the review process. So this is where we appreciate those contributions. We had our prototypes in Google Sheets. So it's pretty simple. We just show people the 2 contributions. that are pulled from like a another Google sheet. And then we give them an option of A on B on these 4 dimensions that we asked. The dimensions that we asked are, what are you most grateful for? What do you think is the most unique? Which best supports the OM vision and mission? And which best supports our principle of diversity and inclusion? And yeah, there was also kind of 2 levels of surveyors or reviewers. So the entry level is just only reviewing event contributions that actually happened, because that's much more, it makes more sense to most people. But then kind of the expert surveys include this meta review process. So that's where we also put in comparisons that include comparisons themselves, if that makes sense. Yes? Okay. Yeah, so the next phase is honoring. So this is where we use algorithms to rank and benchmark the contributions against the pairwise comparisons. So the ranking process we used in this is as simple as it gets. It's literally just adding up all the votes. And we can do that in this case because I balanced all of the pairwise comparisons. So everything was compared to every other thing once, A versus B, and then it was also compared B versus A. And so because everything's compared to everything equal numbers, we can just add up the tallies, and that's a really cursory step towards an algorithm that obviously can improve for the next one. And so, yeah, once we've ranked, then we benchmark against these pairwise comparisons. So to do this, we awarded 1 om-nom per pairwise comparison. So that meant that for the survey, each survey, including 25 pairs, they get rewarded with 25 om-noms, and then these other contributions get rewarded with 100 and 400 om-noms. And the idea is that there we would have some kind of a range that we can, that should fit within the set of contributions and should be able to scale the rest of those contributions. As for how well it worked, I think there's some flaws in our data. So this is the data showing the benchmarking process. So what I did is basically fit a line to those 3 contributions and then use that to calculate the relative unknowns for all of the other contributions. And I think as a principle that is reasonable, but the data that we collected shows that we've got some kind of skewed distributions here. So for the single survey contribution, which is shown here, there's lots less votes. Basically, it's not a linear distribution. And so I think what's happening there is actually like one survey was just not voted very often at all, because most of our contributions were like a DJ set or a, you know, like a workshop or running an entire stage for the day or something like that. So it just didn't get a lot of votes. And so that's why we've got this like skewed response here. And then on the other end, we're also seeing not a lot of votes, not a lot of difference actually between doing 100 pairwise comparisons versus 400 pairwise comparisons, which you would think there should be quite a difference there. And I think probably what happens there is, well, I can show you in a minute, but basically when things get really big, it's harder to make those kinds of judgments. And also some of our questions are not ideal for that question. So I'll come back to that in a minute. This is then kind of the optional feature of the model that I mentioned, this meta review process. So we had this phase where reviewers that are kind of validated within the community can then weight these dimensions. And so this is where I actually weighted the dimensions that I didn't think were working very well, like uniqueness and diversity. I down-weighted those and so that the other dimensions would be weighted more highly. And then, yeah, the final phase of this is to basically just average across the meta reviewer weightings. So that the net result of this is basically a community response that's guided by the experts within the community as to which dimensions should be paid attention to. Does that make sense? Bit of a anyway, this is kind of like a yeah, this is a pie chart showing the om-noms that each contribution got, which is one of the cool types of data that we can pull out. And so, yeah, next phase is reward. So once we've calculated the value for each contribution, if it's a collaboration, in this version, I've literally just split those om-noms up between the contributors. But in future versions, we could use the same process to divide that sort of bigger contribution up into smaller chunks that then get their own scores within the system. The cool thing, I think, is that when we have this measure of value that's gone into the community, we can then calculate an average. And so this can actually become a fee or like kind of an entry price for the event, which represents the average cost of attending the event. And so in the analyses, I've awarded everybody their omnoms, calculated what the average cost was, and then subtracted that from the results that they got. And what that means then is that some people end up above zero, meaning that they've contributed more energy than they extracted, whereas other people are negative. And that suggests that they didn't do as much as kind of the average contribution. And I have had some people say, oh, that's a bit mean, you know, telling people they didn't do enough or whatever. And the way I see it is that we then offer them a pathway to get involved. So what we're saying is, thanks for coming. It was so beautiful that, you know, you came to our event. We're holding another one. And for this next one, we're charging in omnoms up front. And you don't have a positive balance. But if you'd like to come along, here's some ways to contribute, including sitting at home doing reviews. And I had a really beautiful moment where I was chatting with a member of our community that was saying that they really struggled to get involved and weren't sure how to contribute. And their eyes lit up when I explained this mechanism, and they realized that they could, for a few minutes at a time, when they felt they had capacity, could sit there and do reviews and earn their next ticket to come along. And so I think of it as a really inclusive way for anyone to figure out the way that they want to contribute to the community. And then that contribution can then be recognized for its value. Yeah, and so then obviously you've got some people that end up with way more tokens than they probably need. And so this is where people can start to pay these forward within the community. So you've been thanked by the community for your contributions, and you can then take those representations of gratitude and pass them on to other people to say thank you in turn for the things that you've done. Like, thanks, Mum, thanks, whoever. Thanks for helping me to get to this point so that I can contribute. Because we recognize in academia that we all stand on the shoulders of giants, but it's so rare that we actually get to say thank you to those people in a tangible form that's anything more than just a citation or something like that, or an email that you might send. So this is a way to say, hey, I've been thanked, and I would like to thank you in turn. So yeah, kind of have created some like arbitrary, well, actually what I did is I took a bunch of my excess omnoms and I thanked everybody who came just for coming, because I didn't want there to be an obstacle, and I didn't want people to have negative scores after this. And I definitely don't need 3,000 omnoms. Angela's decided to, Angela's been leading a new project called Rising Hearts, which is a really beautiful women's arts gathering. And so what I put in there is like a potential use case could be trading some of the omnoms for project funding that then get fed back into the community. And yeah, basically you could just pay it forward to anyone within the community for anything that you appreciate that they've done. The next phase is then respect. So this is where we identify experts within the community, and we acknowledge them with numerical indicators. So what I've calculated expertise here is literally just the percentage of total omnoms in the field of interest. And this can be broken down in whatever types of tags we apply to our data. So here I've done it for DJ expertise. So you can see we had 5 DJs play on the day, and these are the relative proportions of omnoms that they received. Obviously, this is just one event, so we do this multiple times, and we'll start to learn over time who are the people who are consistently adding value in that field, and that'll start to get reflected. But of course, there's different ways that we can calculate this. This is just a first pass. And then here's like a breakdown of science expertise, and I created this so that it would kind of give a window into how we could use this at AIMOS. These were the talks. We had a really awesome talk on lucid dreaming, and I gave a talk on OM. And Jilly, who I mentioned in the first slide, was helping out doing the survey conducting before the gathering, and so was also involved in one of the scientific process that got tagged in this process. Yeah, and then we've got review reliability. So here's where we can look at test and retest. Like I said, we did A, B, but BA as well. we didn't control who got the surveys. So it's basically a kind of sample of convenience. But within the surveys, there's enough repeated measures that we can start to look at retest reliability. And that's what you can see over here in the blue bars. Some of these, just to note, 100% is because there was only 2 or 3 cases of test retest, or even, 1 case. So we definitely need to look at reliability of this data. But then also what we can look at is test retest. I don't know if this is the right term, inter-rater, but what it is looking at somebody when their BA test is done by someone else and whether they respond in the same way. So this is kind of how it's more about how consistent are you with the crowd or with the other reviewers, which is not necessarily a good thing. It's actually, the crowd could be wrong and you could be right, but it's still a measure of interest, like knowing if people respond in the same way the crowd do, or if they tend to be pretty unique. And then self-bias, this is basically just looking at the percentage or likelihood of you voting for your own contribution versus someone else voting for your contribution who was doing the review. Yeah, and so this is a first pass into working out who are the reliable reviewers. The idea is that in the beginning, all data is useful, so everybody gets rewarded with 1 omnom for each review. But over time, reviews of this same event will become less and less useful to us, right? So once we have a pretty clear picture about what the crowd thought about all of the contributions to TinyOn, adding 1 more review probably isn't really going to influence things very much. And so we can actually play with the reward schedule over time so that the reward that you get for new data is based on, say, the informational gain of the system, if that makes sense. So that's something to, explore in the future. And I just wanted to highlight this because this is some actual use cases. These are some actual use cases of omnoms for the first ever time. So what we had is we offered our headliners some money, just like $100 per hour of whatever they were doing, DJing or workshop. And so we also gave them the option to take that money or to just leave it with the community. And Nigel was one of the people who were pre-selected, but very kindly said, no, the community can keep the money. But those who chose to take the money, what I've done is take the average cost of the relative valuation of dollars within our system. So one of the contributions was donations that people made on the day. And so we have a dollar value for omnoms, which is 0.802 omnoms per dollar. And so what I've calculated here is basically when people took that payment for their headline act, the number of omnoms that should have cost them, and subtracted that from their balance. So now we have a way for people to trade their omnoms in for resources that are available in the community. And to give a window how that might be possible, because where does all this money come from, right? Well, we are a DGR registered charity. And so we've taken our first big donation of $50,000, but we anticipate taking more donations in the future. And so if we're in a situation as a community where we have surplus money available and we have things that we want to have done, like have festivals, or we want to do research on the data that we have, then we can make that money available by application, basically. So people can apply to the community and say, hey, I need to pay my rent. Can I trade in some of my omnoms? And the community can say yay or nay. And that becomes then an autonomous funding mechanism for people to meet their needs so that they can continue contributing and then earning omnoms and then keeping the merry-go going around. Also, I thought I'd give a shout out to Nige. So Nige is part of a band called the Wish Fulfilled. And one use case is that Nige is borrowing my speakers, but they're on speakers. So we figured that one use case could be like trading omnoms for resources. So in the same way that you can trade omnoms for money, you can also rent resources that we have available as an organization. And so these might be equipment. We've got a bus. It might be art that Angie or others make within our community. And so people that want to go to a festival could apply to our community to borrow a piece of art that they take along and then get a free ticket in exchange. So the basic concept is trade your omnoms for whatever the community has available so that we can create this kind of market-based sharing system. And actually, this radical market idea is something that Alex Holcomb pointed me towards. It's this idea that you could give up the idea of ownership and lease things from the society instead. And what we have here is a mechanism where people could put bids on things that they want to use, like resources, even renting, whatever it might be, and basically lease those from the community as a kind of percentage of their bid. And I won't go into the mechanics of why that works really well, but there's a really beautiful book called Radical Markets. And that's a nod to that, and I recommend reading that book because it's a really cool idea. All right. So that's kind of the data. I don't think I need to show you the data. We can jump into it maybe in the later section if it proves useful. But that's the link down the bottom there if people want to check it out. We also took some feedback about the pairwise comparisons. Basically, people found it pretty easy and relatively comfortable. And it was also less than, on average, 23 minutes to complete one of these surveys. So less than 1 minute per comparison. So your omnom is roughly equivalent to about a minute of effort at this point. Some successes, this is a prototype for an autonomous community controlled system where we decide the values that we're interested in. And we also honestly and transparently rate the contributions so that all of that data is then accessible, analyzable, and we can iterate and improve over time. It was transparent, replicable, inclusive, diverse, and I see it as a first step towards an autonomous gathering template. So what I mean by that is if we have a record of all of the contributions that were required to make this event, and alongside that, we have a score that the community has given for the relative value, then we can create a template that's fully autonomous in the sense that people could just come along and decide, oh, I want to do that task, or I want to play that role, or I want to do these 3 things because I know that'll earn me 100 omnoms, and I know that's the average ticket price for a tiny. So we then have the precursor to a kind of decentralized job board where there doesn't need to be anyone in charge saying, hey, can you do this? Can you do that? The system is in charge and people can pick the tasks that they're interested in doing. I guess on a bigger scale, like a global scale, I could imagine these templates, once we get it to the point where it's highly replicable and reliable, then people around the world could decide, oh, I want to do that. That's cool. I want to host a festival. And all they need to do is, say, find the 5 key roles that need to be filled first, might be 5 friends, and then they get together and then they kind of kickstart this festival in a new location that then taps into this same mechanism, and then all of these communities could start to pop up and start to communicate in this same language around the world. Some limitations. So this isn't a complete data set. So like I said, it was an open event. We didn't capture everybody's name who came along. So that's one limitation. For the next one, when we do another TinyOM, it'll be at a place and we'll know who came along. We also don't have 100% record of the contributions, and nor were they put into the prototype. But my intention is in the coming months to start putting in new contributions and rating them relative to the existing set that we have, and explore that idea that we can just keep iterating and updating over time with new contributions as they come in. And also, there was this sort of skew benchmarking that I found, particularly for uniqueness and diversity. And I think probably like what I thought was happening there is that these values are too high and too low. So what I'd like to do and planning to explore is also rating 2 and 8 surveys so that we can have a kind of better spread of those pairwise comparison contributions. There's also other ways that I've started exploring, which is like using an ELO ranking algorithm, which is how they rank players in chess, because that's a much more dynamic and nuanced way to provide these kind of ranking scores. So I just mentioned that. There's also this idea to start looking at priors. So we have the average, value of a workshop, for example. So we could start exploring how that affects the evaluations over time, building in prior information. This is just saying that the pairing algorithm really should consider whether someone actually was at the DJ set or whatever, but it's not currently. And then also another thing I'm interested in is comparing the pre and post event reviews, because that's a parallel to academia where you've got, say, a paper that's just been published and we do these reviews, and those reviews are kind of largely based on whether that paper is going to have impact, you know, whether it should get published. But then whether it actually has impact is a totally different question. And so within this system, we have the capacity to have prediction over time and find out who are the super predictors, who's really good at predicting what the crowd are going to enjoy as things go on over time. And yeah, like I mentioned before, regulating the amount of reward based on people's reliability over time. That's something I'm interested in exploring. Yeah, dimensions, I don't think were, well, they're pretty hastily chosen for this time, but I think could use a bit more thought. This is a spread of possible dimensions that's kind of based on Maslow's hierarchy of needs, but basically tying the dimensions that we ask to a value set that is important to our community. So that's something I'm interested in looking forward. And yeah, like I said, we are developing an app, and when we do, we will be reviewing contributions from OHM gathering that happened in June and was a glorious 3-day event, but had way too many contributions to analyze using our prototype. So I'm waiting for the app before we can analyze that data set. But when we do, I think that'll be a really interesting data set to look at. And then, yeah, at some point, probably early next year, I'm looking probably for a tiny OHM because, to be honest, OHM gathering burned me out pretty hard. And I think tiny OHMs are more manageable. Plus, we've got that data set already, so we can start to build on that. Yay. So, yeah, this is the final slide and the final part, which is an invitation to collaborate. What I think we have here is a kernel. I think of it as kind of like, I feel like a lot of what we do in meta science and open science is try and solve the symptoms, because we have fundamentally a corrupt system at its core that isn't doing what we want, and it's not fundamentally transparent or any of the other principles that we're interested in as a community. And so what I think we have here is this, or something like it, could become the kernel or a seed from which we grow a new system. And different communities could adapt and explore and add different layers that do the types of things that they're interested in. But this, I think, is a core that could become the beginning of something that we start to use to communicate to each other what we find valuable. And what would be really interesting is to use something like the AIMOS Conference as another prototype example. So we have another situation where people have gathered, we have done stuff, and we could collectively decide amongst ourselves what we value and what we appreciate, with the view to moving towards some kind of an autonomous research system that we're in control of. And so to do that there's some interesting questions we could discuss here if people are interested. So dimensions, which could be tied to values that we have as a community. The scope, as in what types of contributions should be included in this, what's too big, what's too small, what should we externalize and not worry about. And then more interesting stuff, like what questions should we ask? Like, are we interested in gender balance of the scores? Are we interested in, well, yeah, you tell me, like what are the questions that we want to interrogate? Because this data is fundamentally transparent, and as long as we agree to it, can be made open to analysis. So we could ask some really interesting questions as a step forward towards potentially a grant application, or bringing in some money into this type of prototype and system we're developing. What would we need to do this study? Well, we'd need reviewers. We would need meta researchers, because this isn't my area. I'm a neuroscientist by training. So I certainly don't have the skills for the type of meta research I imagine going on with this system. And also potentially there's this question of ethics. I know that all of the workshops and everything were published transparently on the AIMOS website. But then if we were to develop this prototype and then attach scores that we've given to each of these contributions, is that violating ethics? And so I guess what I would suggest is that as long as we ask people if they're willing to be involved, and they sign off to say, yeah, I'm happy for my contribution to be used in this way, then I think we'd probably be covering it. But I'm super keen to hear from people that are more experienced in this area, because I'm not. And yeah, something I'm really interested in is looking at inter-community dynamics. So we have a prototype for OHM as a community, and what we value using that tiny OHM data. But if we were to do this for AIMOS, we would have a second use case of a different community that we're using the same system, and we could explore how these communities could potentially interact. So that could become the beginning of a sort of exploration of a, I guess, universal language that communities could use to share value and collaborate. And with that, I don't have a funny closing slide like I saw everybody have today. So I'll just thank you for your attention and for being here.